Welcome to the second in these lecture talks on the topic of utilitarianism. In the previous talk we saw that the utilitarian principle could be defined as that creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility or the greatest happiness principle. This is the statement from John Stuart Mill, which was one of the statements of the utilitarian thinkers of the 19th century that I offered you. They broadly agree that utilitarianism holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness, pleasure and pain principle. And that applies both to individual actions, the actions of individuals, and also to the actions of governments, which is what we're primarily concerned about in this course. And I pointed out in relation to that doctrine of utilitarianism that it had a number of features as a way of thinking about policy and about government action. Firstly, it was forward-looking and consequentialist. It asked of any policy or action, what will it do in the future? What will be the consequences of doing this now for the future? It doesn't look back to the past. It defines the good in terms of pleasure. It's impartialist. Everyone counts for one and no one for more than one. It weighs all claims equally in that sense. It relies on an idea of interpersonal comparable utility. You can measure happiness or pleasure across different individuals, and you can gain some sense about how much more happiness one set of individuals will have as a result of a policy than another set of individuals. And that it's applicable at the individual and collective level. And I pointed out that it was also a philosophical programme in the sense that it was supposed to provide a general framework for the way in which we think about practices like punishment or promise-keeping or overriding individual rights. And there are large questions there about whether utilitarianism will end up punishing the innocent or encourage people to break promises or override individual rights that I will come to in the next lecture talk. But here I want to concentrate on the inner logic, as we might think about it, of utilitarianism, the concepts and the ideas and the relationship of those concepts and ideas in and of themselves, irrespective of the extent to which, when we apply them to questions of action or policy, they have counterintuitive implications. And I'm going to look at the question of measurable utility, interpersonal comparisons, and whether the good can be reduced to pleasure. These are three questions that have been raised, as we will see, almost from the beginning of utilitarianism itself. So let's take first the question of measuring happiness, then interpersonal comparisons, and then pleasure and the good. So measuring happiness. Now, this was the picture I presented of measuring happiness, and I guess that when we think about science fiction ways of measuring happiness, we think about the brain being wired up to some utilitometer, which is capable of registering on a scale how happy or sad we are. And that might make it seem as though, if only for practical reasons, this would not be a very good instrument of public policy. I mean, the idea that we can go around wiring people up on a large basis in order to judge their happiness is not a very plausible one. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean that the idea of happiness has not informed public policy, and I suppose that the most prominent example that we would find at present would be the work of Richard Layard, Lord Richard Layard, who was formerly an economist at the LSE, and I think has been important in trying to pioneer the idea of happiness as a guide to public policy. And you can see here his Action for Happiness website. So someone like Richard Layard is going to be confronted with the question, well, how do you measure happiness? I mean, if you're thinking that governments ought to promote happiness, ought to increase the amount of happiness, how do you do that? Well, I don't have time to go in fully into the Layard approach, although I do encourage you to look at the website if you're interested. But the principal device that Layard and his colleagues who are in the happiness industry, so to speak, use is basically a self-reporting questionnaire. They ask people how happy they are, how happy they've been in the last few months, and so on. Now, the important point about this self-reporting questionnaire don't have to wire people up to a device. But the important point about it is that it does seem to give meaningful results at the aggregate level. So it's possible to determine how far people are more happy in general now than they were 4 years ago, or less happy, and also to compare across societies. And in terms of policy implications, I suppose the most striking feature to come out of it, although I don't find it particularly surprising myself, but it's good to have some empirical backing for this, is that what really improves people's happiness is the quality of their social relations. What really makes a difference to people's happiness is the extent to which they feel able to trust others, that they feel secure with others, and that they enjoy good social relations. Now that's important because in a way its negative counterpart is to say that simply making people richer, simply giving them more money, would not of itself lead to more happiness. What you need to think about, for example, is the extent to which people can get jobs near their own home, they can stay close to their family, they're able to relate to one another in public spaces and parks and social events and so on, rather than simply having more money and acquiring more goods and piling them up. So I think if one works through the happiness approach to public policy, as someone like Richard Laird has done, tried to do systematically, one does get some quite interesting and striking claims out of this. And that there are differences between societies. Unsurprisingly, there are differences between societies because there are differences of trust and levels of integrated social relations between societies. So I do recommend looking at that website and trying to look at what Laird has to say about policy implications. Well, that brings me on to interpersonal comparisons. And this has been an issue for utilitarianism for a very long time. It became a major issue in the mid-20th century, and the legacy of those controversies and debates are still around with us at present. So you will remember that one of the implications of interpersonal comparisons was that it may well be that if you've got a relatively small number of people with lots of money and a relatively large number of people with little money, that there should be some redistribution. And the underlying logic, the underlying insight of that view was the fact of diminishing marginal utility. The thought that as people got richer, so their increment of happiness decreased relative to those who were poorer. And it would follow from that logic that if you redistributed income from the better off to the less well off, you would increase the total sum of happiness. Now, that does rely on interpersonal comparisons of utility. If you think about this graph, if you think that we're comparing two people here, not just the same person at different levels of income, but two people here, then we're basically saying that we can compare the happiness of the person at the highest level of income with the happiness of the person at the lowest level of income. Now, that may seem intuitively obvious, but nonetheless, it's true, for example, that as people get wealthier, so their tastes change and they become more expensive. So it may well be that the people with lower incomes are very happy having supermarket wine, cut-price supermarket wine. They like it. They enjoy it. It gives them plenty of happiness. Those in the higher levels of income require something a bit more sophisticated. They've acquired a taste for, this is a bottle of Santenay, rather expensive French Burgundy, just by way of illustration. They've acquired a taste for, quote, the good things of life, which are typically the more expensive things of life. And if that's true, if tastes adapt to income, it may well not be the case that those on higher incomes get a smaller increment of utility for any given income change than those on lower incomes. So this has been the problem that critics of interpersonal comparisons of utility have pressed. They've said that you really can't compare individuals in this straightforward way because some individuals have expensive tastes, some individuals don't have expensive tastes, and if you redistribute income from those with expensive tastes to those with less expensive tastes, you might actually find yourself decreasing the quantity of happiness in society. And this led on to quite a major discussion, primarily within economics, within that branch of economics which is known as welfare economics, about what are the implications for policy if interpersonal comparisons are unreliable. And the argument was that if you really could not compare across individuals, you didn't have a basis for redistribution, because you couldn't be confident that in redistributing income from those with more income to those with less income, that you were actually increasing the total quantity of happiness. And the only changes that policy ought to aim at are those which are said to be Pareto superior. Pareto was a leading economist at the beginning of the 20th century. And a Pareto superior point is one that makes either everybody better off or that makes some people better off without making anybody else worse off. Now, that's quite a demanding test for policy. It's very difficult to find policies that make everyone better off. Some people argued, and this was particularly important in the context of free trade, some people argued that what you could find, however, were policies which made some people better off, and indeed so much better off that they could compensate the losers. So a very clear example of that would be free trade or the European Union, the free mobility of labour and so on. So we know when the UK was in the European Union that it was participating in a regime of the free movement of labour. That almost certainly raised total income. But for some people, it might well have depressed their income, particularly low productivity workers who would have faced wage competition from migrant workers. Now, the argument was of the Pareto, those who argued for Pareto superiorities, you should still go for free trade, provided you could put mechanisms in place that would compensate those losers for their losses, and the gainers would still be better off. Now, there are all sorts of practical and indeed ethical issues to do with that, particularly the extent to which, if you argue for Pareto superiority in that sense, you really are committed to doing something to compensate the losers, and it may well be very difficult to put schemes in place to compensate losers. So all I'm saying here is that what might seem a very remote philosophical question about the extent to which we really can make interpersonal comparisons of utility, which is what utilitarianism in its classical form seems to require, those very abstract questions nonetheless played themselves out in policy discussions. And anybody who is following the discussion about free movement of labour, Brexit and work visas, on what that would mean and so on, and claim that if you don't have the free movement of labour, then British workers are better off because they're going to get paid more. Anybody who follows that discussion in the newspapers can see this argument being played out quite specifically. That brings me on to the final sort of intrinsic issue in utilitarianism to do with its logic and its conceptual foundation, and that's to do with the equation of pleasure and the good. So here is a quotation from Nietzsche, one of a thinker whom I always regard as one of life's permanent adolescents, really. He went round being very sarcastic and critical of things, but nonetheless, as many adolescents do, had some insight. And his remark in The Twilight of the Idols, one of his works, is that man does not seek happiness, only the Englishman does that. For Nietzsche, what was really important was the struggle to achieve, to display one's excellence, and so on. That was much more important than being happy. Now, that question of is it happiness that we're interested in, or is it, so to speak, excellence and achievement that we're interested in, was actually discussed by the utilitarians themselves. And John Stuart Mill, who was a more complex, or thought human psychology was a bit more complex than Bentham and his own father, James Mill, said famously in Utilitarianism, reflected on this question, and he said, look, it's actually better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So this pig is obviously very, very happy indeed. And Mill said, look, even if people were as happy as pigs, it'd be much better to be a human being where you could plan about your own life and give meaning to your own life and so on. And he went on to say, well, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So at the bottom here is a picture, a very famous picture by David of Socrates on his deathbed, willingly going to death and pointing to heaven and saying, look, I understand my philosophy is such that if the world is amiss, so to speak, I prefer the pure intellect of the life of pure intellectual contemplation and philosophy than of just ordinary transactions in the world. So this is a discussion that's been going on even within utilitarianism. Is it excellence that we're concerned about, or is it happiness? And if you look at the interview that I did with Philip Schofield, the director of the Bentham Project, he's rather sceptical of this idea that you can qualify the utilitarian principle by considerations of excellence. And if you like, pure utilitarians have always rejected this speculation of Mill. The danger of that, of course, is that it leads to a society in which if the government could arrange for everyone to be in a happiness vat, then that would be a good thing to do. And some people have been critical of modern societies because they think not that governments put people in happiness vats, but that by a combination of bread and circuses, sports, mindless television programs and so on, people can be made happy without actually thinking about the organisation of their society. And that leads on to a sort of more general worry about utilitarianism and a concern with political values generally, which is that in some of its versions at least, utilitarianism can seem to give a very administrative view about politics, in which social planners so arrange things that everyone's happy. And that ignores the active side of citizenship, the fact that in a democracy people wish themselves to take control of their lives and don't simply wish to be administered. And I think we'll see that some of this being played out in the policy example that we'll be looking at next week in terms of health policy, which is a priority setting health policy has in fact taken on a lot of the utilitarian perspective. So that's all I want to say on the intrinsic difficulties of utilitarianism. In the next lecture slide, in the next lecture talk, I'll talk about the relationship of utilitarianism with our intuitions about promising punishment and the protection of minorities.